want to cover today. So I did want to get started promptly. Just a few housekeeping announcements before we begin. Just a reminder to keep yourselves muted during this webinar, and feel free to use the chat to communicate with each other, as well as Lauren. I have Lauren Backes here today, who is kind of helping to support this seminar. Any questions that aren't answered today, just in case we run out of time, you can either email me, or I will be collecting some of those questions and perhaps addressing them in a future article on our University of Minnesota Fruit and Vegetable newsletter. This webinar will be recorded today, so if you're interested in getting a copy of this recording, we are planning to send this one out as well as our previous webinar recording after this Zoom meeting, and then it will be posted on our Small Farms YouTube channel. And if you're not familiar with that channel, it's got a lot of great other resources on it to support you with growing either fruits or vegetables. And yeah, there will be a survey that kind of pops up after you leave the room today. If you take a moment to fill that out, it just helps me a lot. I get to kind of understand how this went for you all today, what other crops you might be interested in pruning, things like that. So I really appreciate you taking the time to do that. But welcome everybody, as you all are here. Thanks for joining our noon webinar today. If you have not been to a noon fruit webinar before, I'm happy to be with you for the first time. My name is Madeline Wimmer. I'm a fruit production educator for the University of Minnesota Extension. And yeah, today we will be talking about dynamic apple tree training and pruning. So this talk is really going to be focused on freestanding central leader trained apple trees. And while a lot of, or most of this talk is kind of framed towards commercial or hobby growers, there's a lot that can be applied to backyard growers. So don't feel like you're in the wrong place if you are joining us as a backyard grower. But let's get started here. All right. So today we're going to be talking a little bit, introducing apple trees and the concept of pruning. And then we'll be talking about pruning during training, right? During the establishment process when trees are just beginning to mature. We'll go on to cover information about annual pruning, and then I'll have a few considerations at the end of this talk. So this talk, as many of you have been exposed to pruning before, or perhaps you have years of experience already pruning apple trees, you know that it's very challenging to kind of memorize techniques or just have a textbook understanding of pruning and then feel successful going out there. So this talk is really going to be us thinking about things, critically thinking about how we make decisions. And I would really say that, sometimes pruning is described as an art or a craft, but it's really, for me, it's kind of a mixture of these horticultural concepts and guidelines. But everything's going to have to really line up with your own values and your own system. So again, apple trees, there's so much to be covered with apples. So you'll have to figure out, with what I say, what really applies to you. I'd like to also acknowledge David Bedford. Some of you may at least know him through the legacy of the Honeycrisp apple. He was one of the breeders of the Honeycrisp, and I spent a lot of time with David this past year, really learning from him and his experience, along with Jim Elskamp, Kate Skapansky, and Les and other staff out at the University of Minnesota Horticulture Research Center. It's really a center that focuses on breeding, but they're out there pruning all the time, and they have a lot of information, a lot of good information. So I'll frame this talk by starting off with saying that the priorities for apple trees are a little bit different than our own priorities as growers. So while fruit trees produce fruit, their primary goal is to be producing seeds so that they can have viable offspring to continue their life cycle indefinitely. So similarly, this is kind of going in that same line that trees grow naturally in the wild all the time. They do not necessarily need our help in order to grow. But with the way that trees naturally grow, again, they're not shaping themselves, or they're not growing in forms that are, the most optimal for fruit production. Um, So free-form growth, which is kind of this natural form of growth, can kind of look umbrella shaped, and it can lead to having multiple leaders or multiple trunks. Perhaps, a tree size and shape that is goes beyond what you would want. You may end up having very narrow branch angles and very upright branches, and this can lead to unbalanced canopies as well as less uniform fruit ripening, as this type of science has been studied, was studied decades ago, really. Here's a picture from 1975 of a preformed umbrella-shaped apple tree showing that the first coating on the outside of that type of shape would get a lot of sunlight, but that sunlight would reduce as you continue to go into the canopy. So additionally, it's very challenging. I have a long history of working with grapevines, cold climate wine grapes that are not grafted, that you can just kind of hack at the ground and regrow them and retrain them, and it's okay. But with trees, we really have kind of a limited ability to back up. It's possible to back up with different apple trees, and there are people. I have a colleague down in Iowa State who has been learning about has been recording videos and tracking her progress with an abandoned orchard. So that is a topic. We won't be going through a lot of that today, but I'll touch base a little bit on that towards the end. But when we try to back up, by the time that trees have grown so big, their branches are much larger, they're going to be leaving larger pruning wounds and all of that. So that's why um, we really want to aim to be training trees in order to create a well-formed architecture that leads to strong tree branches, even sunlight and airflow into the tree. So the airflow is going to increase or decrease the amount of time it takes for the canopy to dry. And having very wet canopies usually is what leads to a higher disease risk. So that's very helpful to have more airflow as well. And then even just direct sunlight, not just to the leaves to help with photosynthesis, but to the fruit itself to help with ripening, as well as the floral buds on the trees, which are going to be producing the fruit for the next year. So, in addition to that, for commercial growers who are using certain pesticides, every time you have a very dense canopy, it makes it harder for any spray to penetrate the canopy and reach the inner parts. So, that is also helpful. So, we'll jump into talking about training apple trees here. But first, for those who are a little less familiar with apple tree anatomy or terminology, I'm going to run through this really quick. So apple trees, most modern apple trees that we work with today are grafted. This means that we have a top portion of the tree known as the scion that produces the fruit, as well as that scion's going to be grafted or kind of secured onto a rootstock. And that rootstock is going to contribute properties to the upper tree. We're working with trees, so we have a trunk, and then we have a lead branch that's continuing to grow the tree upward. We have these main scaffold branches that are getting larger and larger every year. They come off of the trunk, and then off of those main branches, you have lateral branches coming out. The types of shoots that you're dealing with are either going to be vegetative shoots or spurs, which are going to be producing fruit. And then we have other very vigorous, more vigorous vegetative shoots that can kind of sprout up in the middle of the canopy. Those are referred to as water sprouts. If you ever hear that term, that's what that means. And then suckers are going to be shoots that emerge from the base of the tree. Here's just a couple of pictures. On the left here, we have our spur. And so this spur is going to be producing floral flowers, and then it's also going to be producing some leaves, and those flowers are going to be turning into fruit. I also have just a picture of a large branch here, and then another picture showing this region where you can see that this last year's shoot is connecting to the previous year's shoot, and then just some branch architecture there. So trees, when they're first planted, if they're planted from seed, they have to go from a point of being very juvenile where they're not producing fruit, and then they grow to a specific height. They've gone through a certain amount of maturation, and they are now mature adult trees. But as I just mentioned, most of the apple trees that we work with today are actually grafted. So that grafting wood is mature, and but it's just a mature branch that has been grafted onto a rootstock, and it too is going to be needing enough time to grow and actually produce fruit. But for those who have been working with apples for a while, I think it's kind of fun to geek out on this, that apple trees are technically kind of in an arrested adult state rather than going from a juvenile tree to an adult. If that doesn't register for you, just kind of ignore that. That's not an important concept for today. Um, so as the apple trees, after they've been planted, they begin to grow and they're establishing themselves. They're going to be maturing and developing their vascular systems. They're all the roots and the canopy is going to be growing. And then there's a number of physiological processes that are going to happen to help the tree begin to bear fruit. So establishment is this larger process that may involve, irrigating and all the care that you need to give to the plant. Within establishment, you have tree training, and the point of tree training is to lead to a certain shape. So we started talking about how we may want to lean away from that free form shape. And then within that training process, pruning is a part of that. So we select certain branches to keep, we're removing other branches, or potentially cutting back branches to weaken them. And again, why am I talking about training during a pruning talk today? This is a quote from C.G. Forshee, who wrote a very classic book or classic manual from Cornell on training and pruning apple trees. This was done almost 50 years ago in 1976. And they say training and pruning are inseparable because they are companion practices in the young tree. And the training of the young tree determines in large part the type of pruning required by the mature tree. So we are really guiding the growth and the form of the tree from planting until maturation. And from there on, it's kind of more about maintenance if this process has been sound. Again, this is sort of ideal. There's going to be a number of cases where, perhaps a tree was planted and it didn't get the early year attention. And there are still ways you can address that tree. That's okay. But we're just going to talk about this from the start of the process to the end. So since that book was written, we've had a lot of rootstocks introduced that are even more dwarfing and leading to even more high density systems than what was described in that publication. So today we have high density systems that are more a hedge of apples trained on an actual trellis system. And we'll touch briefly on that today, but again, the focus is really going to be on the central leader freestanding trees. And this is just to show you, if you're less familiar with rootstocks, a comparison of these different rootstocks relative to the size of what's considered a seedling apple tree. And so that seedling apple tree would be grafted onto just a random seedling that is planted, and those trees can get very large. So you can kind of see comparisons. We have a gradient of dwarfing effects of the tree becoming smaller due to it being grafted on a rootstock. Not only does that tree become smaller, but it also ends up producing fruit a lot faster, which we'll talk about. So here I have just this display again to show you three different directions that a person may be going when it comes to just the actual training system. So on the left, we have freestanding trees here without any support. In the middle, we have training systems or a freestanding tree with support to help support trees that are smaller but may still have a really heavy fruit load. That support is necessary there. And then finally, this is an example of one of those high density systems where a tall spindle training system is implemented. All training systems benefit from or require training. So the type of training required is really going to depend on how quickly the tree matures, as well as the goal for the final form of the tree. What is that shape going to be looking like? So a note on this word precocity, as I mentioned, that rootstocks are not only dwarfing those apple trees and making them a little bit smaller, but they also mature faster. They get to the point where they start to produce fruit a lot quicker. And this is an important concept because fruit does a number of things. So without fruit, shoots are going to be very vigorous and they're going to be very upright. because there's nothing to weigh them down and there's no hormonal signaling happening. But the minute that a branch begins to start showing those little spurs, you know that you're going to be seeing fruits. And this is important because when fruits start to be made, they draw energy from the tree. So a lot more carbohydrates and energy are going into the fruits, which means it's slowing down the growth of the branches themselves. They also weigh down the branches. So if you have a lot of fruit on a smaller branch, it's going to be bringing that branch down. And then there's going to be some hormonal signaling to the plant as well. There are multiple training methods. So in addition to pruning, which I mentioned, that's at point 2 there, there's also the option to do branch manipulation and positioning. So let's say that we are working with an apple tree that is not producing fruit early. It's not weighing the branch down. It's not slowing vigor because those apples aren't there to draw that energy out. So these would be like semi-dwarfing trees, larger semi-dwarfing or standard trees. They're going to require a little bit more attention to creating more horizontal branches, to guiding those branches into a more horizontal position. And this is where concepts like weighing branches down or spreading branches or even tying trunks to the trellis wire, for example, or a training pole can be helpful. But then again, today we're going to be talking a lot about branch selection and pruning. But additionally, right, as I'm saying these things, there's still a need for high density trees to be trained. Putting in a trellis is not it's not cheap, it's labor intensive, so it would be hard for me to say that high density trees don't need training. They do, they just need a different type of training. Um, and just a quick break here, again, kind of going into some fruit science, a couple of concepts. The first one being basal dominance. So basal dominance is the concept that lower limbs are going to dominate over kind of competing upward facing limbs. So they do well spreading out, and there's not going to be a large need to take over when you have this open center shape. And I'm saying this because this open center is one method that you can get a lot of sunlight into a tree. And it works really well for stone fruit trees, trees like peaches and apricots. However, apples display a lot of what's known as apical dominance. So apical dominance means that they like to have a central leader. So you'll see again, we have always kind of this leading branch that's going to be guiding this growth for our apple trees. See it again on this picture as well. And if you try to prune a tree with an open center, you can do it, right? There's no one holding you back from doing that. But what you'll probably see is a lot of upward shoots kind of coming towards the middle, trying to replace that central leader. So this is why um, for freestanding trees, the history kind of goes that, first people were just growing trees, with a free-form shape, and that's an option, right? But if it doesn't lead to a lot of sunlight going into the canopy. So the next thing that was sort of explored was this open center concept. And all of this, understanding how apple tree habits are, led to this final central leader shape, which really looks like an A-frame or a pyramidal, or sometimes people will say Christmas tree shape. But the difference is that if you've ever heard of Christmas tree pruning, they're literally pruning that tree into the shape. We're not doing that here. When you're pruning a central leader tree, you're doing it by selecting weaker and weaker branches as you go up. If you prune an apple tree similar to a Christmas tree, you'll get a lot of funky growth coming out, and it's just not going to work out super well for your goals. So here we are, a picture of our semi-dwarf freestanding tree, and this is supported with the pole again. And then we've got our high density trellis system. And this, again, we won't be going into a lot of details on this today, but this training requires a trellis. And the variability in high density training comes down to the tree shape. So oftentimes you'll see a single leader, but there are systems being implemented in Washington where they have double leaders going. There's a lot of creativity that can go on with this, along with tree density. So this is about 3-foot spacing, but they can become even more dense than this. And these root systems are going to be a little bit smaller. These trees are, you can see they're not going to be getting as thick of trunks. So they are a little different to work with. They need irrigation, all of that, a little bit different needs. And that's why it's a little too much to try to fit all of, that whole system into this talk. So I kind of present these 3 different infographics here showing the training requirements for a standard central leader, which may involve branch positioning, and will likely involve branch selection and pruning. The semi-dwarf central leader trees that are still freestanding, but perhaps have some sort of pole supporting them, where again, branch selection and pruning is going to be needed. Branch positioning might be needed depending on how quickly the tree matures. And then training poles or posts may also be used. And then that dwarf tall spindle system where you're going to have a trellis system and you are probably going to be selecting branches and pruning along the way to guide that growth. So today, as I mentioned, we're going to focus on central leader training and pruning. What are our goals when we're trying to train a central leader tree? We want to promote a balanced canopy for that young growing tree. We're going to be maintaining the central leader. And then we're going to select those main scaffold branches and guide the canopy architecture year by year. Additionally, you may think about where you want to start your canopy height and remove any branches before the height of your first set of branches. You'll want, if you have multiple trees next to each other, you want to be thinking about your planting distance and whether canopies might cross over each other. And we're going to be encouraging strong, wide branch angles. And just before we go on to talk a little bit more about training, this is a good time to introduce pruning cuts. And so I'm going to break this down. It may be a little different than what you've heard in previous pruning instructions, but I'm basically going to distill it down to pruning cuts that discourage growth and pruning cuts that promote growth. So our cuts that discourage growth are oftentimes considered thinning cuts. And this is when you, again, if you cut a branch, depending on where you cut it, it may stimulate a lot of growth, which you may not want, or it may inhibit the growth. So how do you determine which happens? Branches are going to have hormones coming back, and they basically always want that leader similar to the main trunk. So what we want to do is cut, if we're cutting back a main branch and we want to not have it stimulate more growth, you want to cut it back to another lateral branch. And this picture here shows you that. So we left basically a leader. This is kind of like a pressure relief valve. David Bedford will say that sometimes. And that makes it so that that branch on the end grows, but we're not going to see a bunch of shoots coming out at that junction there. Similarly, you may cut a branch back to the trunk of the tree in order to try to remove it and without any regrowth, which can be more or less successful. And here again are just a couple more examples showing a branch that was cut back to a lateral branch. This is a really great thing that you can take away from this pruning webinar today. For example, if you're a backyard grower, this is one really important concept to remember about pruning. On the other hand, if we're trying to promote growth, then we're going to be doing something that's known as a heading cut. So this heading cut, or when you head a branch or you head the top of a tree, this is basically cutting back the branch, not to an actual lateral branch, but basically to a point on the branch in between two different lateral branches. So it's kind of a midway point. And when this cut happens, all of a sudden the branch kind of goes, in simplified terms, Where is my leader? I need a leader. It starts to want to produce more growth, and that's why it's going to actually stimulate growth. And perhaps that's not what you actually wanted to do. Maybe you're cutting back that branch because you wanted the branch to get smaller. And now all of a sudden you have all this regrowth happening. Here is another heading cut, which is oftentimes referred to as a Dutch cut. But again, I'm trying to really simplify things so you can have heading cuts that happen partway through a branch, and you can have heading cuts that are basically just a little stump outside of a trunk. And the Dutch cut, or this style of heading cut, has kind of gone through more research in the past years, where previously people would encourage everybody to do this angled cut because they wanted a branch to grow from underneath, and the idea was that it would be more horizontal. But this is not always necessary. And if you do an angled cut, all of a sudden you have a perfect platform for water to pool, as you can see on this drawing here. You can see how easily water could pool up there. And we'll talk a little bit more about wound healing in a bit, but that's not helpful for wound healing. So water can facilitate pathogens. And here's another upright cut. And then you can see here where this apple tree just did not respond at all. So different varieties respond more or less to this style of cut. But basically, the take home is that you're leaving a stub near the trunk to encourage growth. So if you were to do a ton of heading cuts, just cutting along branches all over the tree, similar to that Christmas tree style, you're going to be getting a lot of regrowth. And so this is what that looks like, right? So this is actually an aronia berry bush near my home. And the person who had dormant pruned this kind of did it similar to how you would approach summer pruning, where they really kind of did a hedge cut. So they did all these heading cuts, and that led to all of this regrowth, which is not really conducive to our goals. It leads to a lot of shading within the canopy, and that's not necessarily the best thing to do. So moving forward here, if you want a little bit of some step-by-step guidance for training a young apple tree after planting, again, we're talking about freestanding trees, not high density here. You can think about growth that you want to be weakening or removing, and growth that you want to encourage. So what would we want to prune after planting an apple tree as it grows year by year? As I mentioned earlier, you're going to want to take off any branches that are below the decided canopy height, which is kind of, again, that's your decision. There are some guidance for that. So, between 30 and 45 inches can be standard, but that's really your decision based on what equipment might need to go under a tree, things like that. You want to be trying to inhibit or discourage any blind wood on a trunk. Sometimes when a tree grows, it'll have a lot of branches, and then it has, no branches here, and then it starts to branch again. We'll talk about what that might look like and what you might do if that happens. You're going to be taking off any competing branches from the sides that are competing with the central trunk. So any branches that are getting to be about in between a third and a half of the size of the actual trunk can be weakened or removed because they're really competing with that central leader. And then any of those early main branches that are coming off the tree, if they start to have lateral branches too early, that's a lot of energy putting into those lateral branches that isn't necessary, and those can be thinned out. So quick, there's a UW extension publication out there that really goes into step by step more for standard apple trees, but you might be asking yourself, should you be topping a tree after planting it? And really, this comes down to what type of tree you've planted. So the types of trees that you might be receiving that you're planting, if you're a commercial grower, you'll likely be receiving a whip. And a whip is a single leader that does not have any branching on it. They're usually less expensive, and they're easier. They're still pretty simple to grow from there. And so this is an example of a whip that was cut back. And the reason why it was cut back to this height is because when it's cut back like that, we know that we're forcing buds to break, similar to that other heading cut where I cut back the branch. So this is going to be encouraging these buds to break and to start growing in directions. And here from this publication, right, they're kind of showing what that might look like the following year. Um, so the other option is that you might get a feathered tree. And this feathered tree means that it's a bare root tree that still has some branching that has started. And in that case, you may be doing some heading back, or you may be leaving it and just selecting which of those branches that are on that tree you want to keep and which ones you want to remove. The third option is going to be an actively growing apple tree that was potted when you purchased it. And so this instruction is not necessarily a guidance for that. That can be very particular. Sometimes potted trees are going to be much older, and it's really going to be a case by case dependence here. But that's just a note about when you may want to top an apple tree after planting. And here we have a scenario. Some of these scenarios, I did this with David Bedford. So again, kind of highlighting him a little bit here and some of his teachings. So we had come across a tree at the Horticulture Research Center that had already grown out for a year, but did not branch. And in this case, we actually headed it back to try to force branches to break. So even though this tree had already grown for 1 year, we still headed it back because every time you head back a branch like that, you're going to be forcing those buds to break from the branch. There are some methods like notching that can also contribute to this. I'm not going into that today, but I just wanted to mention that. Here's another training scenario. So these early scaffold branches are competing with the central leader. And you can see that branch isn't that big, but neither is the trunk. So in this case, we still wanted to weaken that branch because it was competing with the leader. And David just cut back this branch, and because there's not a lot of reserves in this little tree, it's not going to just like fire hose out another shoot at you. So that's kind of helpful to hear. That's just one more scenario of when you may cut back a branch during the training process. And then here's another example. As I mentioned, your early scaffold branches could be putting out some lateral branches. So here I've got this main scaffold branch coming out of the trunk. And then this main scaffold branch has a lateral branch coming off of it. And it's a little early to have that. I mean, you could leave it, but again, that branch is going to mature year after year after year, and there's not a lot of other branches coming off. So eventually this is going to become pretty unbalanced. So use your judgment, but you can remove those lateral branches during the early years. And then here we come to talking about what do we want to encourage during training. So we want to be encouraging horizontal branch growth through selection as well as guidance. And when I say guidance, that might be that case where if you're working with a standard apple tree that takes a long time to mature and produce fruit, you may be doing some weighing down of branches, but also just encouraging balanced growth. And what is balanced growth? Balance growth can look like balance up and down the trunk. It can look like balance growth around the trunk on certain areas of the tree, and it can look like balance growth on the branch itself. So that example with removing that lateral branch would be kind of putting the actual branch into balance with the rest of the tree. And then this is sort of a classic diagram here talking about why branch angle matters. Branch angle matters because wider branches are going to be stronger branches. So if you have a very narrow branch, you have a narrow crotch angle between the branch and the trunk, and that is more vulnerable to splitting, whether that's from the weight of fruit or that could be from a windstorm or something else. Additionally, narrow branches are very, very vigorous. They want to put a lot of energy towards vegetation. So that's just another point there to think about. And as you're thinking about all of these different guidance and direction about training apple trees, remember this is all dynamic. So it's always just going to depend on you kind of looking at each branch individually and making a decision. And I'm showing this because I have a very upright, vigorous branch here, but you'll notice, you'll see some spurs here. And all of these spurs are going to be ready to produce fruit soon. So what is that telling us? When we start to see fruiting buds on a branch, that's telling us that the growth is going to be slowing down soon because there's going to be fruit on there, and that's going to be shifting over where the tree is putting its energy. It's going to be putting a lot more energy towards fruit. Additionally, if this branch was a little bit smaller, I mean, you can see still has a little give to it. Probably it's not so large that nothing could weigh it down slightly. But if this branch was a little bit smaller, you could imagine even more that having fruit all along it is going to weigh it down to more of that horizontal position. So sometimes, again, sometimes you're growing a tree that's going to mature early enough where those branches are young enough that the fruit's just going to weigh it down, and you don't have to worry about tying branches or trying to force branches into horizontal positions. But if you know that you're growing a tree where it's going to take a longer time, maybe 5, 7 years to produce fruit, um, then that's when you may think about positioning branches. And this can be done in a number of different ways. There's options to weigh down branches with weights. There's options to use clothespins when shoots are really small coming out. This is when you have that whip and it first starts to branch. You're going to have very small shoots, so you can use actual clothespins to force them horizontal. And then there's also ways that you can stake down branches. But over drooping is possible. So here's a great picture of a tree that is now trying to bring that, now we're trying to do something to prevent it from over drooping. So it actually has a chain tied on it to the trunk to try to lift it up. We're not even trying to pull it down at this point. And one variety that I know of that does more of a trailing growth habit is snow sweet. And so again, just being aware of your variety, and it can be so challenging sometimes to find information about certain varieties, but um, as you continue to work with it, you'll kind of get to know some of these things as well. So when branches are overbent, they tend to really have very slow vigor, and it can affect fruit size as well. So coming back to balanced growth, here's another training scenario where we have a young tree that was very top heavy, not desirable. You can see large branches coming out of the top and then all these little tiny branches here in between, and then some branching at the bottom. It's good that we're seeing branching. It's not completely blind wood. But in this situation, we did decide to cut back these branches that will still stimulate that growth, but it does weaken those branches. Again, remembering that the reserves in this tree are pretty limited because it's such a small tree. So that was kind of the solution for that scenario. And then again, balance along a branch. If you have a young branch that has a lot of branching at the tips, either forks or tridents, as some people might say, eventually those branches are going to get bigger and bigger, and again it's going to be weighing down just the tip of that branch, and you have to kind of project in your mind, how is that going to affect my tree health in the future? So in this situation, we chose the branches to remove and we reduced it to a single leader. With this situation on the end where you have that upright branch and that more horizontal branch, you would usually remove the upright branch unless you knew that you had a or a variety that was a little bit more drooping, or some other way where if you knew that eventually when there's fruit on this upper branch, it's just going to weigh it down. So again, you're making these decisions, and which one do you choose? It's going to depend a little bit on what you're working with. So again, I'm just putting this up here for anybody who really wants that step-by-step guidance. This is that UW Extension pruning guide for those of you who might be interested in that. So just a recap on how you may choose or not choose a branch to be removed or to be kept with the tree. You're going to be looking at the branch and how large it is compared to the trunk. If it's too large compared to the trunk, you may weaken it or choose to remove it. Or maybe, again, you're starting to see fruiting buds and you don't want to get rid of all that fruit and you know it's going to be slowing down. And then you're like, well, maybe I just don't need to worry about that. You want to be thinking about the branch angle and the growth habit of your tree, as well as what else is going on in the canopy around it, right? So you want to keep the whole tree in perspective and again, look for those fruiting buds. So pruning during training is not always straightforward, but we can learn from each individual tree because they're all so different. And establishment goes beyond training. So just a few pointers. Remember, you will want to be protecting trees from wildlife. You're going to want to keep up on nutrition and making sure that you're irrigating if you need to, paying attention to caring for the tree to manage any disease or insect pests. And then just again, every establishment depends a lot on how your rootstock is interacting with your site. Now we'll jump into talking about pruning mature trees, annual pruning. So I mentioned that training involves pruning. When you hear annual pruning, this generally is going to be referring to pruning mature apple trees. And then you may hear a term called summer pruning, which I just wanted to briefly touch on. And that is not what we're talking about today, but that's going to be basically pruning off this year's growth, green growth during the growing season. Where do apple trees lie compared to other fruit crops? And again, this is going to depend on whether you're talking about, probably high density versus freestanding trees. And this is very subjective. But my point here is that apple trees and most tree crops need a lot less pruning than shrub crops or vines do. For example, grapevines need a lot of pruning. You end up pruning about 90% of last year's growth off every single year. This is not the case with apple trees, especially if good attention was given to training the tree, guiding the tree during its early years, then really this is sort of that maintenance phase. But still, there's going to be things that happen, and not everyone's going to be in the same place with everything. So the goal really ideally is to prune the least amount necessary while still addressing the tree's needs. Our goals are going to be maintaining the tree size as well as the tree shape. So that central leader training in this case. And we're influencing the microclimate. As I mentioned at the beginning, we really want to be increasing airflow and sunlight. And this influences pruning in general as we're removing branches that have fruit on them or fruiting buds on them. We are influencing the crop load. So that means that you're taking off a certain amount of fruit when you prune, and you just want to be aware of that, right? You're changing the vegetative and fruit balance on that tree. And all of this relates as well to plant health and thinking about diseases. Again, having a good canopy microclimate is going to be creating a healthy canopy that reduces or can decrease the likelihood of disease. But when you're pruning, you also just want to be aware of if you do have any diseases in your orchard or your area, and how do you work with that tree in a way where you're not spreading those diseases? How do you mitigate spreading diseases further? So as I mentioned, we really want to train the tree into a central leader shape and not prune it into that shape. However, there's going to be certain things that you can always do that kind of still work with it if you missed your training chance. You may want to be considering a few different things, right? So I had already talked about spurs, and we talked about how fruit comes out of spurs. However, some apple trees do tend to bear more on their tips. There are a lot of heirloom or what was it? Antique apples used to be a term I would hear. Antique apples that have more tip bearing qualities. There are actually some old school apples or cider apples that are more like this. And so if you had a tree where it was bearing more on the tips, you would want to know that so that you don't accidentally cut back too many tips of your tree and, take off a lot of fruit. You may want to ask yourself if fire blight, which is a disease caused by a bacteria, or other diseases might be present. And then you'll want to think about how long it's going to take you to finish your pruning. If you're in a backyard setting or a small orchard, you may have not need a lot of time, but if you're in a larger orchard, you're going to really want to think about how much time you need to allow to finish your pruning before the growing season begins. And then tool inventory. So you'll want to know your tools, you'll want to care for your tools, all of that. So here are just a few apple pruning tools. We tend to have saws and then loppers and pruning shears. Kind of put the pruning shears and loppers together because they both have similar blade tips. And then we have hand saws as well as pole saws. And our pole saws can either be electric or manual. And then there's also variability in loppers and shears where loppers can have ratcheting, or both loppers and shears can be ratcheting. So that means you're kind of taking it in chunks rather than trying to squeeze and maybe hurt your elbows if you're doing the manual right. So this one would be a ratcheting lopper, along with this pruner is also a ratcheting pruner. This lopper is pretty cool. I have a set like this at home, and they can actually extend out. And another thing to think about are blade materials, but also what is the head looking like? So you have something like this may look like what's called an anvil blade, where an anvil blade basically comes down and it hits a point, whereas a bypass blade is going to come down and kind of sweep past a point slightly. This is important partly because those bypass blades allow for less pinching of the branch, so they're a little bit nicer to work with. However, this lopper here, while it may look like an anvil blade, it actually has a little bit of bypass capability. So just get to know your tools. Again, we have electric options here. This is an electric pruning shear. Pneumatic, which is pretty expensive, but you're going to get a lot of power out of that. And then we just have a classic manual pruning shear here. How do you maintain your tools? Just a quick note on this. So I have the diluted bleach here, but I'm mostly recommending isopropyl alcohol or Lysol, products like that that you don't have to dilute yourself. Bleach technically has a label, and technically, you would want to follow that label, but it doesn't really translate very well to growers. Sanitation is usually going to be recommending that you spray your tools and leave them for 10 minutes. We don't have time for that. So making sure that your tools are clean is going to be a sure way that when you wipe your tools with isopropyl alcohol, you're really just sanitizing them. So it's similar to when we have dirt on our hands, we can't actually sanitize the surface of our hands until that dirt comes off. It's the same with tools. And then you just want to make sure that you're storing your tools in a cool and dry place, and then sharpen them yearly as needed when you can. Sometimes if you have a coating, if you have a coated metal blade, it's tricky to sharpen them. But yeah, there's trade-offs to not having a coating as well, where you can have more corrosion. So let's finally get into talking about annual pruning by introducing what it means to make a pruning cut and to promote good wound healing, because this is so important in Minnesota, right? We have cold winters where you may be concerned about wound healing. So as I mentioned, diagonal cuts are, so I'll back up here. With pruning, you'll sometimes hear that every cut should be diagonal. And this is important for upright branches, but as I kind of showed you with some of those Dutch cuts, even when that was upright, was that angle enough to really let water fall off of it? I don't know. So you'll have to use your judgment, because ideally you don't want to make a diagonal cut. A diagonal cut is going to have much more surface area. It's going to expose the wound a lot more than if you just make a round cut. And that's kind of the summary on diagonal versus not diagonal. Round cuts just have a smaller surface area, so it's less of a wound to heal. You want to know the right tool for the branch diameter and height, right? So some loppers are going to have much bigger blades and they can handle larger branches than others, but at some point you may be transitioning to a saw, for example. Um, and as you start to prune, you may think about how you use your body and how you use force when it comes to pruning larger branches. You don't want to be adding so much force for large branches in a way where they end up breaking rather than being pruned, but just pay attention to your body in that process. And then if you're removing larger branches at the trunk, you may want to notch them before. Sometimes you'll hear this as like a 3-point cut. Again, let's simplify it. Let's just bring up the point that we're just trying to provide that notch before that other branch gets cut so that it doesn't end up breaking the branch. That's what a 3-point cut is all about. And then, as we had mentioned, when you're cutting these branches, you want to really cut them to branches. If you're not removing them at the trunk, you want to cut them to another lateral branch. Here's that 3-point cut. So when you're removing a branch, you want to notch it, as I mentioned. So you're going out almost to a stub, notching, and then removing the whole branch. And then you can come back and remove that stub, but you're going to remove it at what's known as the branch collar. So the branch collar is a region that allows for good wound healing. So you can see in this diagram here, if I cut this way, I'm leaving a smaller wound and I'm cutting at this junction. If I were to cut into the tree, I'm leaving an even larger wound and I'm not leaving a lot of space in case that branch does have a little bit of dieback by chance, not guaranteed. But how do you promote good wound sealing? You'll want to think about the time of the year. We'll talk about that in a moment, as well as the weather during pruning. Are there pathogens present? Do you know if you've had an active fire blight infection? Thinking about how you're cutting the branch, of course, and not, not breaking the branch. And then if there are a lot of pruning wounds in one area, that can be a lot of exposure and a lot to heal, and something to perhaps avoid depending on how large the branch is, depending on how many branches are in one area. So, what's the best time of year to prune? This is a question that folks ask all the time. And again, this is going to be about likelihood. So when it's colder, we're more likely to have, we have cold weather, right? And we're more likely to be experiencing wind with this cold weather, potentially, right? Depending on which site you're on. So if you have very cold weather and you have a lot of wind, I'll back up here and say that this may not be as conducive, not as promoting of healing as warmer weather. So healing of a branch after it's been removed, there's an initial response where the plant will kind of block up the wound with different chemicals from the plant, suberin and lignin for those who are more plant geeks, and it will do that initial blocking up because branches, when they actually heal, they really just cover their wounds. So it has to initially block it up a little bit to try to prevent pathogens from coming in. And that process happens a lot faster when it's warmer. Additionally, if it's cold and you have a lot of wind, that wind is going to be drying out the pruning site. And so there's the potential, again, when it's colder, for delayed healing to take place, as well as damage at the pruning site based on a lot of wind when it's really cold. When it's really warm, we have this advantage of that pruning response happening a little bit quicker as well as the callus response happening quicker. But now all of a sudden we have this risk of pathogens being able to enter. And I'm just telling you this as, not giving you a straightforward answer. I apologize. But again, this is sort of what biology is, right? The likelihood of infection may go up if you have diseases present in your orchard when it's warmer, especially if you have humid and wet conditions. So ideally, if it's warm, you don't want to prune when it is also wet. And ideally, when it is cold, you don't want to prune when it is also going to be very, very windy or drop a lot in temperature the next day. So again, not straightforward answers here, but this is something to think about. And this is actually something I'm trying to discuss more with my colleagues because it's just important to think about. So those are your advantages and disadvantages of both times of the year. And here we've got some pictures of this callus formation happening, kind of this enveloping at the pruning wound site. And then here you can see a picture of damage, of a pruning wound that was damaged. And now all of a sudden, you're really opening up the way for a lot more pathogens to come up. So hopefully, maybe stay tuned with me on that discussion and we'll have more talk about it. So we're getting closer to the end of the talk, and you can tell that this is like actually the smallest portion of the talk. Once again, because ideally, that attention is going into training and everything, and then we're really doing this as maintenance. But again, stay tuned. There's going to be opportunities for us to do more noon webinars. If you're looking to learn more about abandoned orchards or working with trees that have not been pruned for years and you want more information about that, please let me know in the survey at the end of the hour. So these steps, there's a number of steps that can be taken to prune a tree step by step. You just need a place to start, right? There's so much to think about. Why not just have a few solid places to start? But of course, it's going to all depend. So I'm going to kind of put that disclaimer out there that what I'm about to tell you is going to depend based on the canopy density of a certain area relative to other parts of the tree. How balanced is it? A branch's overall size, as well as whether there's fruiting buds on that branch or not. What is the variety like, as well as what is the tree age? So first step, you can remove. So that's helpful. Broken branches, they're going to be susceptible to disease and other issues over time. We want to remove them. Branches that are crossing over either within one tree or between two different trees, they're going to be causing shade for each other. If they rub on each other, they're going to open up some wounding. And those branches, you're going to want to make a decision, but ideally you do not want branches really overlapping or rubbing on each other, whether that's within a tree or between two trees. Step number 3. You can prune water sprouts and vertical branches. So again, these sometimes they're called buggy whips, but they're just these really upright, strong vegetative branches. So you can remove those. Something to be aware of, though, is that when you start to remove water sprouts or vertical upright branches on a large or mature tree, this can sometimes lead to a lot of growth happening after that. And so one thing that you can consider doing is to come back after you've removed those branches when shoots are really, really young, and you can kind of rub them off at that point. And when you rub those shoots off, those pruning or that wound is pretty small, it's pretty tender, heals pretty quickly. So that is something to consider doing. And then the fourth step is just to thin out dense parts of the canopy to increase airflow and sunlight. And again, you may be thinning out the canopy by actually taking a branch all the way back to the trunk, or perhaps taking back side branches, lateral branches to the main branch, or maybe you're bringing back the tip of a main branch to a lateral branch, as we've discussed. You may want to top a mature tree. So we talked about topping or heading our early planted trees, and you may top a mature tree. I have said so much already about how apple trees don't necessarily like their leaders being taken off, but if they become very low in their vigor, this is when you can actually remove that leader and reduce the height of a tree and not have a lot of regrowth, especially if you remove that leader to another side branch, as we already talked about. So that is an option, and that can be helpful if you're spreading hail netting over a number of trees, or if you just need a uniform canopy height for any other reason. Pathogens, insect pests, and pruning, what should we think about? Well, just in general, the dormant season can be a good time to think about sanitation, blowing leaves out into the aisles and mowing them. This helps to break down the leaves faster, so if there's any spores on them, those also break down. But this is also a good time to be thinking about removing fire blight branches and shoots in order to prevent their spread. And when you do that, here's an example of a branch that's infected with fire blight. You can see there's kind of this divide here between the dying part and the fresh part. What I would want to do is I would want to go way back here and remove the branch at this point. So as much as you can, basically about 8 to 12 inches below the visual infection to try to not get spores and infection material on your pruners. After you remove that branch, you have the option to sanitize it with isopropyl alcohol or another appropriate solution. And then, again, you're not going to probably be able to do as much rinsing and oiling immediately every single time, but just take good care of your pruners as you continue to prune from time to time. And if you are visiting apple trees that haven't been pruned for a while, it takes time, takes patience. Maybe at some point we can get my colleague from Iowa to talk with us about that since she's very knowledgeable about it. But you also want to try to avoid removing more than about 25% of the tree's growth because after that point, again, you've kind of reduced the number of hoses on the tree and it's got a lot of reserves in its trunks and roots and it just wants to push all of that growth back out. So removing a ton of growth on an apple tree during a year when you're trying to actually make it smaller may do the opposite. Uh, just some signs of what might a weaker tree look like. We talked about weak branch unions being very upright. We didn't talk about cankers, but this would be basically wounds on the trunk or different areas. And then you may see poor wound healing and increased suckering. And we're just at the hour. I have a few more minutes left of this presentation, and then we'll finish up here in just a couple slides. So flag your trees to follow what happens throughout the year, and this will help so that you can make observations and learn from year to year. Pruning is a complex process, it's very dynamic, and in that case, you'll want to really make sure that you are kind of taking some notes. And this takes depending on whether you're using manual tools or electric, if you are using manual, just be aware of your body. You're doing a lot of repetitive motion, so take good care of your body. And with that, I'll just say thank you. I'm going to stop sharing now. And I believe, and right now my support staff person has had to head off to another meeting, but I guess I can kind of take a few questions here. I'll be here for a few minutes looking at some of the questions in the chat, but feel welcome. Again, this will be recorded and posted online, and we will send this presentation to you all as well. So thank you so much for being here today. And I'll just read a few questions here as you all trickle out as needed. So cheers to your apple pruning season.
Hey Madeline,
Hey,
I've been looking in the
hey,
chat while you're presenting.
thanks, Jen.
You might be able to help kind of summarize a couple questions. Looks like it was the most recent one was asking about any sort of wound sealant. Yeah, any experience with that? Not sure if the person.
No, from what I know about sealants, they're not really encouraged to be used. Again, the tree ideally is going to be able to do that on its own. But there has been some research recently in Washington where they're looking at actually spraying with fungicide after pruning in a way to reduce fungal infections. So that's something to think about, but I don't have a lot of experience with wound sealing that way. Jen, do you have any experience? Jen is another, I should introduce you.
Oh, that's
She works for the Savannah Institute. She's a colleague of mine and very knowledgeable about apple trees.
just a nerd, just a fellow. No, we had this like weird, kind of like jelly. Like it kind of depends on if you're starting to prune too late, you might see this like kind of weird sappy jelly thing on the end of larger cuts of older trees, and that can attract a lot of pest and disease. I personally haven't used wound sealant. I don't think if you're doing a cut correctly, which means sharp tools. Madeline, you did a really good job of explaining not having any place for water to sit. You shouldn't need a wound sealant, in my experience.
Cool. What
Uh,
else we got in here?
Let's see. There's one about witches' brooms on evergreens, but I think pruning in evergreens. I don't have any idea what a witch broom on an evergreen is.
Yeah, I think so. Witch's broom, from what I remember from plant pathology, like it can sometimes it is so it could be what happens when you do that heading cut and it's just like bursting out like that, but it also can be relating to certain pathogens. Like it can be a pathogen response. But yeah, I don't know a lot about
Usually
that.
a fungal infection.
Thanks, Jean. That's great. Yeah, so Jean says fungal infection, which lines up with what I remember from from learning about some evergreens and plant path. Yeah. Colder and warmer are relative terms. I agree with that. Yeah, and so much about what we do, right? Especially like coming from the grape world to apples, it's, apples are really they're just very dynamic, right? We have variation in rootstock, we have variation in training system and so many different areas, and then you have biology varying itself constantly around it. Jeff had asked if the same applies to pear trees. And one thing I can say, there's a lot that does apply to pear trees, but one thing I'll also mention is that pears, from what I understand, they like a little bit more of upright branches. So what I've mentioned a lot of the with the horizontal branching and trying to really, guide branches into a horizontal position, pear trees are going to tolerate more upright growth.
Yeah, I saw that question.
Mark Phillips, excuse me,
Oh,
Mark
good.
Phillips advises cutting water sprouts like in July after all the fruiting is done, or not the fruiting, but there's no blossoms, the growth slows down. He says you get less response in terms of less um, growth response if you prune at that time rather than doing it in March.
Yeah, yeah, and that's anytime you're doing summer pruning, you're kind of taking away any reserves that would go back into the tree. And that's why if you do remove them at that time of the year, there's just less likelihood of regrowth because you're kind of taking resources away before it goes dormant rather than removing an outlet before it becomes active and wants to push out growth again. Um, and then someone asked, Jen, you might have a thought about this, but do water sprouts make good scions to graft onto rootstock and make a new tree? I would assume not, but what do you think, Jen?
Yeah, it's last year's growth. Especially for there's a folks asking about like kind of pruning older trees in this too. And yeah, I'll just add like I'm a convert to summer pruning because of that. Just because exactly how I visualize it is that the root mass needs to match the crown or like the part you see of the tree. And if you are doing it in the dormant season, the roots are going to outweigh and out energize the top. And so, yeah, you're fighting it all of the time. So, the harder part about pruning in the summer, one, the disease things that you went over, which were really good. You also can't really see the shape of the tree when there's so much foliage. So, like, my route is usually taking larger branches in the winter, just because you can see the form and the shape, and those wounds are going to be big and open. And then kind of keeping my eye on the water sprouts for the year, especially if you're doing top working, which is a grafting method. Water sprouts, in my experience, have been great for that. So, yeah, they want to
Cool.
grow. Just make sure you're not taking them from the roots and the root suckering because those are not the tree you want.
That's great. Thanks for sharing that, Jen. And then Monica was asking about using hydrogen peroxide to sanitize tools. I don't have a lot of experience doing that, and I wouldn't necessarily know the dilution rate, but you're welcome to email me, Monica. I can throw my email in the chat here for folks who are not familiar with it. And yeah, feel welcome to I'll be off next week teaching a number of pruning workshops. I forgot to announce that, but if you are looking for more hands-on pruning opportunities, we do have a few workshops happening mostly in Northeast Minnesota next week. But yeah, I think this is probably oil recommendations for tools. Yeah,
If you
go
have
ahead,
a
Jen.
minute, Carrie Holmberg has a couple of really good questions. Carrie, would you want to come off mute and ask? You had two really good questions in the chat, or I can.
Sure. The one was the seeing the black on pruning cuts that you said were bad cuts. That's something I've seen. I've never been able to know what it was, but the new growth after the black area in subsequent years appears to be healthy. So I've just sort of,
Yeah.
but it does, the black seems to kind of spread.
Yeah, and so I know some people will look at that black and they'll be like, this is black rot. It's not always black rot. Sometimes what happens is that your pruning wound won't seal very well, and then it will basically like partway through the year it'll kind of leak out some sap from it, and then that gets colonized. But any sort of wounding that happens there also is going to open up for more secondary pathogens. So one of the pictures I showed was from Applejack Orchard, and we had actually submitted a sample to the University of Minnesota Plant Pathology Lab. And what we ended up seeing within that branch were a lot of secondary pathogens. So they're basically opportunistic, and they're looking for sites that are breaking down and not doing very well. But that's my understanding of what that is. And so yeah, sometimes again, and black rot, right? It's a common name. So whether, but black rot has an actual pathogen that does affect wood as well. So yeah, it's not always going to be black rot.
Okay, thank you. You had mentioned wanting weaker wood higher up in the tree for the scaffold branches. Is that a matter of what you pick to leave and what you cut out?
Yeah, yeah. And so basically, yeah, if you were selecting branches, you would not, if there was like a super vigorous branch coming out of the top, that would not be, your choice of which branch you would want to select. So yeah, that's kind of that ideal. And Jen, do you have any thoughts about that when it comes to tree training?
Sorry, I was responding to something.
That's okay.
What was the question?
So we're talking about branch selection. Like if you're really trying to get that central leader shape,
Mm.
we're selecting weaker branches going up. And I was just saying that that might look like avoiding, if you did have a super vigorous branch, either like weakening that or avoiding it and choosing, a weaker branch. But
Yeah, and
yeah,
you're talking weaker as like diameter, so just like small.
diameter. Yep. Less vigorous. Just,
Yeah.
yeah. Mm-hmm.
Yeah. And I would also, I would be so impressed to find a pear tree that you could prune or train to an open leader, because pear, most varieties of European pear want to grow directly up. It's actually quite a fight to try to get them to go out. In response to another question about pears versus apples, there's a few questions on when you should start pruning a tree, especially like dwarf and super dwarf trees. Any do you have any recommendations for that? I usually do like by year 3, like giving it time to establish a root base before you start pruning. But then another school of thought is the younger the tree, the easier it is to shape. It's like easier on them. Yeah. What do you think?
Yeah. I mean, I think it's fine to, again, like I'm kind of presenting this route of being able to train the tree year by year, which again, when it's young, the pruning wounds are smaller, so that's a little bit helpful for them to be able to heal. But also, again, it's going to depend on if you're getting a tree as like a bare root that's a whip versus something that's feathered and has branches coming off, or if you were to plant a potted tree. So I think it's, I'm in the school of doing pruning and training and after planting and onward. There could be cases where a tree is like super stressed and maybe doesn't respond very well to it. And there can be cases where, again, if you have a tree that's maturing a lot faster, it probably just doesn't need a lot of attention to training because it's going to be producing fruit faster. And then that fruit's going to be weighing down branches and all of that. So I guess, yeah, it depends a lot, but it depends on, what your tree looks like when you get it. Is there blank wood on it? How young is that tree? All of that. There's someone was saying, Peggy, oh, hey, Peggy. Peggy's saying that Leslie Holland from UW-Madison is no longer advising sanitizing tool after cuts from fire blight. You should check with her about this new recommendation and correct me if I'm wrong. I would trust Leslie if she had said that, especially if Leslie is recommending cutting further back. So again, or is this because is she making the assumption that you're pruning when it's so cold that nothing is active? So yeah, Leslie and I actually saw each other this morning. We are working on an online Apple school. So that's something kind of exciting, but I really want to pick Leslie's brain about, yeah, these responses between kind of, pruning when it's really cold and you might have risk of poor healing at the pruning wound site versus when it's warm, when you have more pathogen risk. But yeah, that's great. Throw my email in the chat again.
Just do
What do you think?
Oh, I was going to do a shout out to the IPM Institute in Madison.
Yeah.
You have a lot of pathogen questions, which it seems like y'all do. They're a really great resource for all of your pathogen woes.
Yeah.
I
And they
agree.
have Apple Talk, is that right, Jen? Is that what they call it?
Yeah,
They do. Yeah.
that's a little more for commercial growers, but
Mhm.
for like they have a lot of resources for more like hobby backyard growers. Yeah, Apple Talk gets pretty nerdy pretty quickly, but it is really interesting.
Yeah, and that's a good resource. And then if you're tuning in from Minnesota as well, and you are interested in potentially submitting a disease sample into the university, you're always welcome to Google the Plant Path Clinic, and then you can call them to kind of check about how to do that process. Um, yeah, should we take like one more comment or question in here? And then again, feel welcome to reach out to me. Can take a little bit to get back to folks sometimes, but I appreciate your patience here. Oh, I guess I keep messaging Geraldine. I'm sorry, everybody. Let me get my email to everyone. There we go. Okay. All right, Sherry, you should have that email now. And I think this is maybe a good time for us all to stop. I'll see you in Duluth as well, Geraldine, perhaps. Yes, thank you all for being here today. And
Thank
again,
you.
if we ever wanted to like do something, write in the survey if you're interested in like having like a grower discussion about pruning next year or something like that. I really do look at all of those. So I really appreciate your feedback and thanks for coming today. And it was a pleasant surprise to have you here at the end, Jen. Thanks for being here.
It was a great talk. Thanks for doing
Yeah.
it.
All right, great, everybody. We'll see you when we see you. Bye.